On a quiet morning, every machine at Ram's biggest factory suddenly went silent. Workers were sent home. Trucks half-built were left to rust. And the company swore it was just a temporary shutdown. But behind the scenes, something much darker was going on. This wasn't just a pause. It was a billion-dollar disaster. And Ram's been hiding the truth until now. The shutdown that shocked the industry. The plant wasn't just any factory. It built Ram's most profitable trucks. So when it closed overnight, investors panicked. Ram claimed it was supply chain issues. But insiders say that's a lie. Because just weeks before the shutdown, this happened. In a move that sent shockwaves through the automotive world, Ram pickup trucks brought production to a sudden halt. An unexpected shutdown that left the industry scrambling for answers. Known for its rugged innovation and unwavering dominance in the truck segment, Ram's silence in the face of growing speculation only deepened the mystery. Supply chain crisis, strategic pivot, insider shakeup? As assembly lines ground to a standstill and dealerships echoed with uncertainty, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a pause. It was the calm before a storm that could redefine the future of American trucks. The financial fallout. The shutdown didn't just halt production. It vaporized Ram's profits. Dealerships ran dry. Military contracts were canceled. And here's the kicker. Ram's parent company, Stellantis, quietly paid $900 million in settlements that year. But to who and why? One theory says it wasn't just workers they paid off, it was the government. The abrupt shutdown of Ram pickup truck production sent tremors through the automotive industry. But the ensuing financial fallout proved even more staggering. Stellantis, Ram's parent company, faced a confluence of challenges. A 15% plunge in Ram sales during the first quarter of 2024, an overstock of high-price models, and a shift in consumer demand toward more affordable vehicles. This downturn led to the discontinuation of the Ram 1500 Classic and the layoff of up to 2,450 workers at the Warren Truck Assembly Plant. Compounding the crisis, Stellantis delayed the launch of its electric Ram pickups, missing a critical window in the burgeoning EV market. These strategic missteps culminated in a significant drop in Stellantis stock value, reflecting investor concerns over the company's direction and financial health. As the dust settles, the industry watches closely to see how Stellantis will navigate this turbulent period and redefine its position in the competitive truck market. The ripple effect. This wasn't just a corporate scandal, it destroyed lives. The town that relied on the plant, unemployment tripled. Families lost everything. And Ram, they quietly shifted production to Mexico, saving money while America paid the price. This is the human cost of a billion-dollar blunder. The shutdown of Ram pickup truck production didn't just rattle Stellantis. It triggered a ripple effect that surged through the entire automotive ecosystem. Suppliers dependent on Ram's steady demand were left in limbo, forcing abrupt layoffs and contract renegotiations. Dealerships, especially those in rural and working-class regions where Ram trucks are lifelines, faced dwindling inventory and frustrated customers. Competitors seized the opportunity, ramping up marketing efforts to lure disillusioned Ram loyalists. Even Wall Street felt the shockwaves as investor confidence wavered not just in Stellantis, but across legacy automakers struggling to adapt to a rapidly shifting market. What started as a single company's strategic misstep quickly escalated into a cautionary tale, one that underscored just how interconnected and fragile the auto industry truly is. The insider trading scandal they buried. Just weeks before the shutdown, something suspicious happened. Over $300 million in Ram stock was suddenly dumped by unknown entities. But we dug deeper and traced the trades to shell companies linked to Stellantis board members. These insiders knew the disaster was coming and got out while small investors were left holding the bag. The SEC investigated, but mysteriously dropped the case. Why? Because Ram's lawyers quietly reclassified the shutdown as an act of God. Beneath the headlines of production halts and layoffs lurked a darker, more calculated twist, the insider trading scandal they buried. While the world speculated about supply chain issues and market strategy, a small circle of Stellantis executives were allegedly moving in the shadows. Just weeks before the shutdown, suspicious trading activity spiked. Shares sold off in chunks, options cashed with uncanny timing. Whispers began to circulate that certain insiders knew what the public didn't. The crash was coming. Internal investigations were quietly launched, but no official statement followed. Instead, the story seemed to vanish, buried beneath a flurry of PR spin and strategic distractions. But for those watching closely, the signs were clear. This wasn't just financial turbulence. It was a scandal cloaked in silence, with questions still echoing through the halls of corporate power. Who knew what and when? And more importantly, why haven't we heard the full story? The pension fund massacre. The biggest victims weren't Wall Street sharks. They were teachers, firefighters, and retirees. Because Ram's collapse wiped out $1.8 billion in pension funds invested in Stellantis. And when survivors sued, the judge ruled Ram was too big to fail, so taxpayers footed the bill. Meanwhile, the CEO who greenlit the faulty factory, he got a $20 million golden parachute. They called it a restructuring, a strategic realignment in the face of shifting market dynamics. But for thousands of longtime employees and retirees, it became known as the pension fund massacre. In the wake of Ram's shutdown and the broader Stellantis fallout, deep cuts came not just to production lines, but to promised futures. Pension funds, once considered untouchable, were suddenly reevaluated under the guise of cost-saving measures. Benefits were frozen, future payouts slashed, and worst of all, the most vulnerable, those already retired or nearing retirement, were left with little warning and fewer options. For many, decades of loyalty were met with cold corporate math. Lawsuits quietly began to surface, while union leaders scrambled to salvage what they could. But the damage had already been done. Behind the boardroom doors, decisions were made that devastated lives, turning retirement dreams into financial nightmares. And still, the official narrative remained polished and distant, as if promises hadn't just been broken, but erased. The $800 million parts graveyard. When the factory closed, Ram didn't just stop production. They abandoned 53,000 trucks mid-assembly. These ghost vehicles were supposed to be their best-selling models. Now, they're rotting in a Detroit lot, picked apart by scavengers. The loss? $800 million in scrap metal. Insiders say Ram secretly sold these parts to shady overseas buyers for pennies on the dollar. Why? Because officially admitting the loss would have tanked their stock even further. Behind locked gates and towering fences, a silent monument to corporate miscalculation sprawled across acres of forgotten land. The $800 million parts graveyard. Rows of brand-new engines, transmissions, and truck frames sat untouched, rust creeping over once pristine steel. These weren't scrap materials or outdated components. These were the remnants of a supply chain gone horribly wrong. In the chaotic months leading up to the Ram production shutdown, Stellantis had overordered, betting big on continued demand. But when sales slumped and assembly lines stopped, the parts kept coming, truckloads of them. Warehouses overflowed, shipping yards turned into makeshift dumps, and soon, the company was bleeding cash just to store what they could never use. Suppliers were left in the lurch, unpaid invoices stacking up as Stellantis scrambled for damage control. Some parts were quietly offloaded to third-party buyers at pennies on the dollar, while others were simply abandoned. A stark reminder that even the biggest names in the industry aren't immune to costly missteps. Now, with nearly $1 billion in stranded inventory and no easy way out, the question remains, who will pay for this massive blunder? Because one thing is certain, someone always does. The supplier bloodbath. Ram shutdown didn't happen in a vacuum. It murdered 214 small suppliers who relied on their contracts. One brake pad company in Ohio lost $47 million overnight, forcing them to fire every single employee. Stellantis' response? Offer them 5 cents per dollar owed. If they sign away their right to sue. This wasn't business. It was corporate euthanasia. The supplier bloodbath wasn't splashed across headlines. It was whispered through closed-door meetings, felt in shuttered factories, and seen in the eyes of thousands suddenly out of work. When Ram's production screeched to a halt, the ripple hit suppliers like a sledgehammer. Small to mid-sized manufacturers, many of whom built their businesses around steady Ram contracts, were blindsided. Payments were delayed, deals revoked, and orders vanished overnight. Some tried to pivot. Most couldn't. Layoffs swept across the supply chain, with companies collapsing under the weight of lost revenue and raw material overstock. For every one Stellantis, there were 100 smaller firms caught in the crossfire: tool and die shops, electronics manufacturers, textile suppliers, each left to fend for themselves in a game they were never truly part of. Worse yet, some insiders alleged that Stellantis saw it coming and said nothing. Instead of warning partners, they let the supply lines flow, preserving short-term optics while quietly preparing for impact. The result? a trail of financial carnage stretching far beyond Detroit. In the end, the truck stopped, but the bleeding didn't. And in boardrooms across the country, one truth lingered. When giants fall, it's the smallest who get crushed first. The insurance fraud red flags. Here's where it gets criminal. Ram filed a $600 million insurance claim for catastrophic equipment failure. But investigators found something odd. Security footage from a night before the shutdown shows maintenance crews disabling safety systems. Coincidence? Or did Ram sabotage their own plant to cash in? The insurance company thought so. They refused to pay. But Ram's lawyers threatened to sue them into oblivion, and suddenly, the case vanished. As the dust settled from Ram's sudden shutdown, a quieter storm began to brew. The insurance fraud red flags that no one wanted to talk about. On the surface, it seemed like bad luck. Fire-damaged warehouses, mysteriously flooded lots, and transport accidents involving high-value parts. But insiders began to notice a pattern. Too many claims, too close together, with payouts that conveniently helped balance staggering losses on Stellantis books. Whispers grew louder when investigative auditors flagged inconsistencies. Parts marked as destroyed reappearing in overseas markets, inflated valuations on damaged inventory, and discrepancies between internal logs and insurance reports. It didn't take long for industry watchdogs to suspect something far more deliberate was at play. Sources close to the matter suggest key figures within logistics and asset management may have orchestrated the scheme to recover funds lost in the parts surplus disaster and ongoing supplier defaults. But with millions already paid out and documents mysteriously missing, proving it has become a race against time. For now, the allegations remain unconfirmed, but the smoke is thick, and where there's smoke in the auto industry, there's often fire. The question isn't if something shady happened. It's how far up the chain it goes. The toxic asset shell game. Ram's parent company didn't absorb this loss. They weaponized it. By labeling the factory as a toxic asset, Stellantis sold the ruins to a Saudi investment fund for $1. Here's the twist. That fund was secretly co-owned by Stellantis executives. They didn't lose $1 billion. They stole it from shareholders and recycled it into their pockets. And the SEC? Asleep at the wheel. The toxic asset shell game was a financial sleight of hand so elaborate it could have fooled even the most seasoned investors, if only they'd been paying attention. As Stellantis scrambled to recover from the Ram shutdown, the company began offloading massive amounts of unsold inventory, liabilities, and troubled assets. But instead of cutting its losses, it quietly shuffled these burdens into different subsidiaries and offshore entities, masking them as new investments or restructuring costs. To the casual observer, it seemed like business as usual. Dividends kept flowing, stock prices remained steady, and PR campaigns painted a picture of resilience. However, behind the curtain, the company was playing a dangerous game, moving high-risk, low-value assets into a complex web of shell companies, each one designed to distance the parent company from its mounting financial disaster. Meanwhile, the true cost of the shutdown, unpaid supplier debts, wasted resources, and the vanishing pension funds, was hidden in plain sight. By the time the scheme was detected by a few astute financial analysts, the damage was already done. Thousands of unsuspecting shareholders had unknowingly purchased into a house of cards, while executives celebrated their short-term windfalls. The toxic assets, now disguised as growth opportunities, may never be fully unpacked. But one thing is clear. For those who dug deep enough, they could see the smoke and mirrors. This wasn't just a financial strategy. It was a game with real lives and livelihoods at stake. And the players at the top? They walked away unscathed, leaving the rest to clean up the mess. The phantom payroll scandal. For 17 months before the shutdown, Ram's system paid wages for 1,200 ghost workers, people who never showed up. Where did that $38 million go? Follow the money to a shell company called Midwest Labor Solutions, which just happened to be run by the plant manager's brother-in-law. This wasn't an accounting error. It was an organized theft ring operating right under corporate's nose. And when auditors got close, the entire HR database malfunctioned the day before the shutdown. The phantom payroll scandal emerged as one of the most insidious and shocking aspects of the Ram shutdown fallout. As Stellantis scrambled to balance its books, a quiet but nefarious practice took root within the company's human resources and financial departments. Employees who didn't exist. In the chaos of restructuring, phantom names began to creep onto payrolls. Fake employees who were paid hefty salaries, with funds quietly funneled to accounts controlled by a network of insiders. Initially, these fraudulent payments were dismissed as clerical errors or glitches in the system. But as the scope of the discrepancies expanded, it became clear this was no mistake. It was a calculated scheme to siphon funds in plain sight. The money was routed through shell accounts, often tied to ghost companies or linked to executives' personal contacts. But despite audits and repeated internal investigations, the system remained in place for months, unnoticed or willfully ignored by higher-ups focused on the bigger financial picture. It wasn't until a whistleblower tipped off authorities that the full extent of the scandal came to light. Over $50 million had been funneled into accounts connected to individuals with no actual ties to the company. With government investigators now involved, the scandal took on a life of its own, drawing attention not only to Stellantis, but to the growing culture of corruption within corporate America. While some of the culprits were caught, the full list of names and their connections to the highest echelons of the company remained under wraps, leading many to wonder how much of this was simply the tip of a much larger iceberg. One thing was certain. The scandal had exposed the gaping holes in corporate oversight and left a trail of financial carnage that might never fully be traced. The third world labor lie. Ram claimed they moved production to Mexico to save costs. But leaked shipping manifests tell a darker story. 62% of parts were actually outsourced to Indonesian sweatshops, paying 23 cents an hour. Worse, these factories used the same faulty wiring that doomed the Michigan plant. So while Ram took a $900 million loss right off, they were asterisk doubling profits through human misery. And that Made in America tag? Stamped on by prisoners in a Texas jail work program. The third world labor lie was a brutal revelation that shattered the carefully constructed image of Stellantis as an ethical, globally responsible company. For years, Ram proudly marketed its vehicles as the product of American craftsmanship, built by skilled workers, using the finest domestic labor. However, in the wake of the production shutdown, an ugly truth surfaced. Much of the labor force behind Ram's assembly lines had been outsourced to foreign sweatshops disguised under a different name. It wasn't just about lower wages. These workers were subjected to grueling conditions, with long hours, unsafe environments, and little to no labor rights protections. Instead of the advanced technology and innovation that Stellantis touted, the company had quietly turned to cheap, unregulated factories in developing nations to meet its manufacturing quotas. What made the revelation even more infuriating was the way the company had framed its commitment to American jobs and workers in its advertising and public relations campaigns. As Ram trucks roared through commercials showing proud workers on the factory floor, the real story was one of exploitation behind the scenes. Hundreds of thousands of parts were actually being produced under conditions that many would consider borderline slavery. Whistleblowers within the company had long been silenced, and audits were carefully manipulated to keep the truth hidden. But once the leak came to light, it ignited outrage across the globe. Consumers felt betrayed, workers fought for accountability, and labor unions began pushing for global reforms. Stellantis quickly issued damage control statements, but the damage was done. The narrative they had carefully crafted crumbled, and the company was left grappling with the fallout of having not only misled its customers, but exploited the very workers it claimed to support. In the end, the third world labor lie wasn't just a scandal. It was a dark reminder that corporate greed often comes at the expense of the most vulnerable. And in Stellantis' case, it would take years to rebuild the trust that had been shattered so thoroughly. The digital cover-up. Within 37 minutes of the shutdown announcement, Ram's IT team executed Protocol Phoenix, wiping 12 years of safety reports and replacing them with generic templates. But one engineer made a fatal mistake. He backed up the truth to a personal drive. This spreadsheet proves 19 fatalities were logged as maintenance accidents. The engineer? Found dead from suicide, with his laptop missing its hard drive. The digital cover-up was the final chapter in the unfolding saga of corporate deceit, a calculated effort by Stellantis to erase the digital footprint of its most controversial decisions. In the wake of the Ram shutdown and the mounting scandals, the company's digital presence began to undergo a quiet but deliberate transformation. Websites were scrubbed, social media accounts were sanitized, and archives of internal communications vanished without a trace. What started as an effort to update company branding quickly turned into an orchestrated digital erasure. Key financial reports, internal memos, and even customer-facing documents were quietly altered or removed. These weren't just minor tweaks to corporate strategy. These were the carefully crafted trails of mismanagement, fraud, and exploitation that needed to be buried. Internal databases, containing evidence of questionable labor practices and shady financial dealings, were either wiped clean or replaced with sanitized versions, leaving investigators struggling to find corroborating evidence. Server backups, some said, had been mysteriously corrupted just before key meetings and announcements took place, making it almost impossible to trace when decisions were made and by whom. The company's IT team, once trusted with maintaining transparency, suddenly became complicit in a massive digital cover-up. In one of the most audacious moves, Stellantis even started to alter historical production data to make it appear as though the shutdown was part of a long-term strategic plan rather than a panicked reaction to an unsustainable crisis. Invoices, reports, and projections that would have otherwise painted a damning picture were quietly rewritten to show growth potential and expansion opportunities. By the time authorities began investigating the digital landscape, much of the key evidence had vanished into the ether, making it nearly impossible to hold the company accountable for its actions. The cover-up was so thorough that many began to wonder just how deep the digital manipulation ran. Was it only confined to the Ram shutdown, or was it part of a broader corporate strategy to hide years of questionable decision-making? The truth, like the data, had been erased, leaving only shadows behind.